White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan previewed the Biden administration's new national security strategy. A top issue, how to deal with China's efforts to reshape international order. The strategy refers to China as America's most consequential geopolitical challenge. And NTD's Melina Wisecup has more.
22 months into the Biden administration, the White House has unveiled a new national security strategy. The 48-page document begins with the letter from the president where he says he believes the world is at an inflection point and that the decisions the United States makes today will determine the direction for the world. Now, in this new strategy, the White House lists Russia and China as global priorities. Unsurprisingly, they also pledged to hold Beijing accountable for its human rights abuses, something that the White House is referring to as crimes against humanity. Now, it also notes China's economic edge. Here's National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan commenting on this new strategy earlier today.
Is that a successful approach to dealing with competition with the PRC means not making countries choose sides, not dividing the world into rigid blocks, and not making our relationship with countries kind of dependent on some kind of proxy fight between the U.S. and the PRC.
As for China tariffs, the White House has been floating the idea of waiving the Trump-era tariffs as a way to deal with inflation. But for now, these tariffs will stay in place while the policy is under a 4-year review. The national security plans comes as President Biden is warning Saudi Arabia that there will be consequences for the kingdom's decision to scale back oil production. The U.S. accuses OPEC of helping Russia.
The only beneficiary that we can see for OPEC's decision is Russia at the moment.
Some members in Congress now calling to punish the region by freezing arms sales to Saudi Arabia.
They get almost 73% of their arms from the United States.
And I am very hopeful that the president will act immediately. He has the power to stop these sales.
Melina, how are Saudi officials responding to this push from lawmakers to cut ties with the kingdom?
So Senator Blumenthal says the goal here is to encourage Saudi Arabia to change course on those oil cuts. He also says that they aim to continue cooperation with Saudi Arabia. They just want to rebalance that relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. Now, in addition to this piece of legislation, there's also another piece of legislation being pushed by Senior Senator Dick Durbin called the NOPEC legislation. Now, this would allow our Justice Department to file lawsuits against OPEC Plus under U.S. antitrust laws. Now, to get to your question, how is Saudi Arabia responding to these actions and this push from U.S. lawmakers? Well, Saudi Foreign Minister earlier today made an interesting comment about the timing of this, pointing out that the U.S. right now is in an election cycle. Let's listen.
Unfortunately, when you're in the election season, what some people call the funny season, a lot of things are said and a lot of things are done that may not make sense at another period of time. And I hope that this is what we're dealing with here.
Now, Saudi Arabia and other countries a part of OPEC Plus are continuing to stand by that statement that they believe that they've made the right decision because their goal is to stabilize the global oil markets. Now, our gas prices here in the U.S. have jumped about 10 cents since last week when OPEC Plus made that announcement to draw back their production. Steve, back to you.
Melina, thank you for that. A group of Republican senators is condemning the Justice Department's attempts to silence dissent about gender transition surgeries for minors. Senator Ted Cruz led the group. They sent a letter to Attorney General Merrick Garland saying his department has abused its authority to police speech in order to stifle the debate over gender transition surgeries for minors. The senators are demanding the DOJ's communications with the American Academy of Pediatrics, American Medical Association, and Children's Hospital Association. They say this is to conduct congressional oversight and bring accountability. As the midterm elections draw near, lawmakers and other office holders are making their endorsements, some of them endorsing candidates from the opposite party. In Philadelphia, former Deputy Mayor Tom Knox, a lifelong Democrat, is opposing the Democratic nominee for Senate, John Fetterman. Knox says Fetterman is soft on crime and that his policies on crime will make things much worse. Meanwhile, Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger from Illinois is also crossing party lines and endorsing a handful of Democrats. He endorsed 4 Democratic candidates for Secretary of State in Minnesota, Michigan, Arizona, and Nevada. He also endorsed Democrats for governor of Pennsylvania and Arizona. Kinzinger has clashed with former President Trump and was one of 2 Republicans on the January 6th committee. And high-profile and now former Democrat and Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard has announced she is leaving the Democratic Party for a wide range of issues, including the Democratic Party's open border policies and Biden's escalating tensions with Moscow. A poll suggests that the majority of Democrats don't want President Biden to run for re-election, and the main reason is because of his age. In an interview, Biden addresses these concerns as well as his son Hunter's possible indictment. NTD's Jason Perry has the story.
They're concerned about whether or not I can get anything done. Look what I've gotten done.
In an interview on CNN, President Biden addressed a poll that shows about 2/3 of Democrats don't want him to run for re-election, and the number one reason is his age.
Name me a president in recent history that's gotten as much done as I have in the first 2 years.
CNN host Jake Tapper asked about the possibility of a recession. And although the Biden administration has been accused of changing the definition of recession from the common 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, Biden said this.
Every 6 months, they look down the next 6 months and see what's going to happen. It hadn't happened yet. It hadn't. There's no guarantee that they're going to be. I don't think there will be a recession. If it is, it'll be a very slight recession. That is, we'll move down slightly.
And one problem Biden's son Hunter is now facing is possible criminal charges. Biden explains.
Turns out that when he made my application to purchase a gun, what happened was I guess you get asked. I don't guess you get asked the question, "Are you on drugs? You use drugs?" He said no, and he wrote about saying no in his book. So I have great confidence in my son.
Biden said he's going to wait until after the midterms before he announces whether he's going to run for re-election. And he added this.
I believe I can beat Donald Trump again.
Biden also mentioned that he's going to continue pushing for a ban on semi-automatic firearms and dealing with global warming. Jason Perry, NTD News.
A new book that came out earlier this year examines the culture war taking place in our country today. It's called The Woking Dead: How Society's Vogue Virus Destroys Our Culture. Joining us to trace the origins of this cancel culture is the author of the book, A.J. Rice. A.J. Rice, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Brother Steve, great to be here, my friend.
Now, I do want to ask you about your book, Woking Dead. Excellent book. Talking about woke culture and cancel culture, it seems to have only recently emerged in society. However, the concept of these ideologies has been around for a long time. How do you think we gradually got to this point?
Look, it's incremental totalitarianism, right? So they take an inch, they take a mile, they take an inch, they take a mile. I mean, look, there's always been political correctness. There's always been the nanny state. But with wokeism, I mean, look, at the core of this, it's cultural Marxism. So in a sense, you know, you can blame Murphy Brown and the pantsuit Gen X mafia from the mid 90s all day long, but you really have to go back to pre-World War I. And, you know, Marxists, they show up here and they look around. They've got Marx in one hand, they've got Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci in another, and they think to themselves, wow, this place has a thriving middle class. I'm not sure we can get a workers' revolt here. Because you have to understand, and this audience knows this, most of the times when Marxists or any of its variations overthrow a kingdom or a government, it's usually a peasant revolt. So they knew they weren't going to get a peasant revolt from us because our blue-collar workers are patriotic. They fight in our wars. They probably fought in the Civil War. They fought in the Spanish-American War. They're about to fight in World War I. And it dawned on them, we need different foot soldiers. And Steve, you know who these guys are because it's the same villains we're fighting today. They infiltrated academia, Broadway, the silent picture industry, which became Hollywood, academia, and then they found home in the Democrat Party of Margaret Sanger and Woodrow Wilson. And if you fast forward 100 years, it's the same people we're fighting. They are the Woking Dead. The only difference is They've got the digital brown shirts now helping them, censoring, deplatforming, demonetizing, shadow banning, and that would be big tech. Big tech kind of acts as the cartilage of the Woking Dead. It's their force field. It picks winners and losers. Whereas 100 years ago, if you wanted to censor the Bible or Mark Twain or George Orwell, it took, lawsuits, and it took a long time because, you're not stopping the printing press. Whereas today, you can knock the President of the United States off of Twitter. You can knock Parler offline, with the flip of a switch. So, we're up against it. But, my theory is this. All revolutions eventually eat themselves. And I don't think the run-of-the-mill person in America likes cancel culture, likes critical race theory. They don't want Steve and Gary, or let's say Jim and Gary, going into the women's locker rooms, right? They don't want that. They don't want the trans mafia coming after their children, grooming their children. So when you see people like Bill Maher, who by no means agrees with Lance and Rice on much, but when you see him out there saying, hey, stop this nonsense, James Carville, stop this nonsense, we're going to lose if we keep going down this woke path, that tells me something. It really does. It tells me that it's the tyranny of the minority.
A lot of fascinating points, AJ. I mean, you mentioned academia and cultural Marxism. One of the incubators for this woke culture is on college campuses. What do you think college students can do to escape the grasps of this ideology that's just permeating? Well,
I was in college right around the time of 9/11, so the late 90s, early 2000s. And, even back then, I didn't have a smartphone. I couldn't videotape them the way I can videotape them now if I was there. Look, a lot of people, you have to make a choice. You go to war with your professor and you get a C. Wear a GoPro camera, right? Go in there like a police officer, right? Bring your own syllabus. That's what I used to do. I was a crazy person. So the teacher on day one would hand out their crazy left-wing syllabus. And back then, it wasn't as nuts as today. And then on day two, I would hand out the counter syllabus. So, if you don't want to read this garbage and that garbage, because I was in the humanities department. And that's the funny thing, Steve. I mean, a lot of this woke craziness used to just be contained in the humanities department of some liberal arts college. But now it's in pre-K all the way up through, law school. So we're fighting them now at every level. Whereas in the past, if you're an engineering student or you were trying to get an MBA, you really didn't run into this diversity, equity, and inclusion garbage. But now it's everywhere. It's even in math, for God's sakes. I mean, it's crazy. But again, it looks like they have the power. They do not have the power. You have to fight back. You could put your head down and do what the teacher says and get an A. But I don't think the people that watch this show, I don't think they're the compliant type.
AJ Rice, author of the new book, The Woking Dead. Really appreciate your time.
Sir, you're a patriot. Keep fighting.